There's a worm in the ground, yes it is. Yeah.
I'm gonna do something for you that ain't never been done before. Shoot, 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 shoot. I'm gonna make you free.
When Leroy Sugarfoot Bonner died in January 2013, he took decades of secrets with him. In his final interviews, the Ohio Players frontman finally revealed what really destroyed one of funk's greatest bands.
I think sometimes I be complaining, I'm always complaining, all the way to the stage, but I really do love what I do.
Their music dominated the charts, but behind the success, internal struggles and industry pressures were tearing them apart.
Do you keep in touch with any of the old band members of Ohio Players?
Most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, some of them, a lot of them now.
This is the secret Sugarfoot carried for 30 years. Leroy Roosevelt Bonner never intended to become the face of funk music. Born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1943, he was the oldest of 14 children in a family so poor that running away at age 14 seemed like his best option for survival. Those early years on the streets, playing harmonica for spare change and sneaking into bars to jam with adult musicians, shaped the man who would later be known as Sugarfoot.
I grew up a little bit, learned how to play a little more jazz here.
When Bonner joined the remnants of the Ohio Untouchables in 1964, he wasn't looking to become a star. The original group had already fallen apart when their leader, Robert Ward, decided to pursue a solo career, leaving the remaining members scrambling to rebuild their musical identity. What they found in young Leroy Bonner was something unexpected, a guitarist and vocalist who could transform their sound from conventional R&B into something entirely new. But Bonner brought more than just musical talent to the group. Having grown up as the oldest child responsible for 13 younger siblings, he understood leadership and responsibility in ways that many musicians never learn. He became the glue that held the Ohio Players together through their early struggles, the voice that kept them focused when record deals fell through, and the creative force that pushed them beyond their comfort zones. The transformation from the Ohio Untouchables to the Ohio Players wasn't just a name change. It was a complete reinvention, orchestrated by Bonner's vision of what funk music could become. While other bands were content to follow established formulas, Bonner pushed his bandmates to experiment with unconventional rhythms, provocative lyrics, and theatrical stage presentations that would later become their trademark. The early years were brutal. The band members worked day jobs while playing clubs at night, often for audiences that didn't understand their music. Bonner would later recall nights when they played to empty rooms, their revolutionary sound falling on deaf ears. But he refused to let the band compromise their artistic vision for commercial success, even when it meant going hungry or sleeping in cheap motels. What the public never knew was how Bonner's childhood trauma informed every aspect of his leadership style. Having experienced abandonment and poverty, he was determined to create a musical family that would never fall apart. He insisted on equal sharing of songwriting credits, made sure every band member had input on major decisions, and created an environment where creativity could flourish without ego conflicts. This collaborative approach was revolutionary in an industry where most bands had clear hierarchies and dominant personalities. Bonner understood that the Ohio Players' strength came from their collective chemistry, not from any individual star power. He deliberately positioned himself as the frontman while ensuring that every member felt valued and heard. But Bonner's greatest secret during these formative years was his deep insecurity about his own abilities. Despite his natural charisma and undeniable talent, he struggled with stage fright so severe that he initially performed with his back to the audience. Only his closest bandmates knew that the confident, swaggering performer they saw on stage was actually terrified of being judged or rejected. This vulnerability would become both his greatest strength and his most carefully guarded secret. It drove him to perfectionism in the studio, pushed him to constantly improve his craft, and made him fiercely protective of his bandmates' feelings and contributions. But it also made him hypersensitive to criticism and paranoid about anyone who might threaten the unity he had worked so hard to create. As the Ohio Players began to gain recognition in the late 1960s, Bonner realized that success would bring its own challenges. The music industry was notorious for destroying bands through greed, jealousy, and external manipulation. He made a private vow that the Ohio Players would be different, that they would succeed or fail together as a family. It was a promise that would be tested beyond anything he could have imagined. By 1973, the Ohio Players had achieved everything Leroy Bonner had dreamed of when he first picked up a guitar. Their breakthrough hit Funky Worm reached #1 on the R&B charts and cracked the Pop Top 20, establishing them as a major force in funk music. Record labels were suddenly interested, concert promoters were calling, and radio stations couldn't get enough of their infectious grooves. But success brought pressures that Bonner hadn't anticipated. The music industry of the 1970s was a cutthroat business where artistic integrity often took a backseat to commercial potential. Record executives who had previously ignored the Ohio Players were now demanding creative control over their music, their image, and even their personal lives. The first major conflict came when their label, Westbound Records, began pressuring the band to replicate the success of Funky Worm by recording similar novelty songs. Bonner watched as other funk acts were pushed into creative dead ends, becoming caricatures of themselves in pursuit of chart success. He was determined not to let that happen to his band, but the pressure was relentless. What the public never saw was how these industry demands affected the band's internal dynamics. For the first time since forming, the Ohio Players found themselves arguing about musical direction. Some members wanted to chase the commercial success and give the label what it wanted. Others, led by Bonner, insisted on maintaining their artistic independence even if it meant smaller record sales. The tension reached a breaking point during the recording sessions for their 1974 album Skin Tight. Label executives were constantly present in the studio, making suggestions that sounded more like demands. They wanted more commercial hooks, cleaner production, and less of the raw edge that had made the Ohio Players unique. Bonner later confessed that he seriously considered breaking up the band rather than compromise their sound. But the real secret that Bonner carried from this period was how close he came to a complete nervous breakdown. The combination of creative pressure, financial stress, and responsibility for his bandmates' livelihoods pushed him to his psychological limits. He began suffering from panic attacks before performances, and there were nights when he couldn't sleep for fear that everything they had built would collapse. The other band members knew something was wrong, but Bonner was too proud to admit his struggles. He maintained his role as the steady leader while privately falling apart. Only years later would he reveal that he had started drinking heavily during this period. Not for pleasure, but as a way to calm his nerves and silence the constant anxiety. The irony was that Skin Tight became one of their biggest successes, proving that they could maintain their artistic integrity while achieving commercial success. But the process of creating it had nearly destroyed Bonner's mental health and strained relationships within the band that had previously been unbreakable. The success of Skin Tight led to even greater pressures. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the Ohio Players. Music publishers were offering lucrative deals for song rights. Managers were promising bigger tours and better contracts, and other musicians were trying to poach band members for their own projects. Bonner found himself in the position of having to protect his musical family from an industry that saw them only as profit centers. The most painful betrayal came when Walter Juni Morrison, the keyboardist whose comic vocals had helped make Funky Worm a hit, announced he was leaving to join George Clinton's Parliament Funkadelic.
bass in the band.
Plays guitar without any hand.
Morrison's departure wasn't just about musical differences. It was about money, recognition, and the lure of working with an established superstar. Bonner took Morrison's leaving as a personal failure. He had promised himself that the Ohio Players would stick together through success and failure. But the first taste of real success had already cost them one of their most talented members. The secret he would carry for decades was how deeply Morrison's departure wounded him, and how it changed his approach to leadership within the band. From that point forward, Bonner became more protective and more controlling. He insisted on being involved in every business decision, every creative choice, and every personnel matter. What others saw as natural leadership, he knew was actually fear. Fear that another important piece of his musical family would be stolen away by the very success they had worked so hard to achieve. The years 1975 and 1976 should have been the happiest of Leroy Bonner's life. The Ohio Players were at the absolute peak of their success, with back-to-back #1 hits, Fire and Love Roller Coaster, that established them as funk royalty. Their albums were going gold, their concerts were selling out arenas, and they had achieved the kind of crossover success that most R&B acts could only dream of. But Bonner later confessed that this period of triumph was also when he began to understand the true cost of fame. The Ohio Players had become prisoners of their own success, trapped by industry expectations and public image in ways that suffocated their creativity and strained their relationships to the breaking point. The problems began with their controversial album covers featuring nude and nearly nude models. While these images helped sell records and generated massive publicity, they also created a perception problem that Bonner hadn't anticipated. Music critics began dismissing their artistic achievements, focusing instead on the sensational artwork. Radio programmers complained about the covers while playing their songs, and retail stores demanded censored versions. What bothered Bonner most was how the covers overshadowed the music itself. The Ohio Players had spent years developing a sophisticated sound that blended funk, jazz, and R&B in innovative ways. But all anyone wanted to talk about were the naked women on their album sleeves. He felt like the band's artistic identity was being reduced to a marketing gimmick, even though the covers had been intended as artistic statements about sexuality and freedom. The internal pressure was even worse than the external criticism. Record label executives began pushing for even more provocative covers, treating the band members like interchangeable parts in a commercial machine. They suggested replacing musicians who weren't photogenic enough, pushed for music that better matched the sexual themes of the artwork, and constantly interfered with creative decisions. Bonner's secret from this period was how desperately he wanted to abandon the controversial covers and return to a focus on pure musicianship. But he was trapped by contractual obligations and the financial needs of his band members. The Ohio Players had become a brand, and changing that brand might have meant commercial suicide. The pressure affected every aspect of their lives. Band members were expected to maintain certain public personas, appear at events they didn't want to attend, and smile for photographers even when they were exhausted or unhappy. The spontaneous joy that had once characterized their performances began to feel forced and artificial. Bonner later revealed that he seriously considered leaving the music industry entirely during this period. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to maintain their commercial success, and the way their artistic vision was being manipulated by outside forces made him question whether fame was worth the price they were paying. The breaking point came during a meeting with record executives who wanted to push the band in an even more explicitly sexual direction. They suggested hiring professional dancers for their stage shows, creating music videos that emphasized the erotic themes of their album covers, and even changing the band's name to something more commercially appealing. For Bonner, this meeting represented everything that was wrong with the music industry. The executives had no understanding of or respect for the Ohio players' artistic journey, their musical innovations, or their cultural significance. They saw only a product that could be packaged and sold more effectively. That night, Bonner made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would no longer allow outside forces to dictate the Ohio players' artistic direction, even if it meant sacrificing commercial success. It was a choice that would have profound consequences for the band's future, but it was also the moment when Bonner reclaimed his integrity as an artist. The secret he carried from this golden period was not about success, but about the courage it took to walk away from a system that was slowly destroying everything he valued about making music. The Ohio players would never again achieve the commercial heights of Fire and Love Roller Coaster, but they would also never again compromise their artistic souls for industry approval. By 1979, the Ohio players were facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything Leroy Bonner had spent 15 years building. The disco era had fundamentally changed popular music, and funk bands that had dominated the mid-1970s were struggling to maintain their relevance. But for the Ohio players, the real problems weren't external. They were internal, and they had been building for years. The first crack in the foundation appeared when tensions over money and creative control began to split the band into factions. Despite Bonner's efforts to maintain equality among band members, success had created disparities that couldn't be ignored. As the frontman and primary songwriter, he was earning more from publishing royalties than other members, even though the band's sound depended on everyone's contributions. Marshall "Rock" Jones, the bass player who had been with the group since the Ohio Untouchables days, began expressing frustration about his role in the band's business decisions. Clarence "Satch" Satchel, whose saxophone work was crucial to their sound, felt that his contributions weren't being properly credited or compensated. Even longtime members were starting to question whether their loyalty to the Ohio players was limiting their individual opportunities. Bonner's secret during this period was how much these conflicts devastated him personally. He had built his entire identity around being the leader who kept the band together, the one who ensured everyone was treated fairly and felt valued. Watching his musical family fracture over money and recognition felt like a betrayal of everything he had tried to create. The situation was made worse by external pressures from the music industry. Record sales were declining, concert attendance was dropping, and radio programmers were shifting their focus to newer artists. The Ohio players were being labeled as yesterday's news, and the constant struggle to prove their continued relevance took a toll on everyone's morale. But the most painful part for Bonner was watching how success had changed some of his bandmates. Musicians who had once been content to share credit and compensation were now demanding individual recognition. The collaborative spirit that had made the Ohio players special was being replaced by ego conflicts and territorial disputes. In late 1979, these tensions exploded into open warfare during what would become known among band insiders as the Meeting from Hell. Called to discuss the band's future direction and resolve growing financial disputes, the session instead became a brutal airing of grievances that had been festering for years. Satchel accused Bonner of hoarding songwriting credits and making unilateral decisions about the band's business affairs. Jones complained that he was being treated like an employee rather than a founding member. Other musicians voiced frustrations about touring schedules, recording budgets, and the direction of their music. For Bonner, this meeting represented the complete failure of his leadership philosophy. Everything he had tried to build, the equality, the mutual respect, the sense of family, was being torn apart by the very success they had achieved together. He later confessed that he left that meeting knowing the Ohio players, as he had envisioned them, were finished. The official breakup came in early 1980, though the seeds had been planted during that devastating confrontation. Band members went their separate ways, some forming new groups, others pursuing solo careers, and a few leaving music entirely. The Ohio Players brand would continue in various forms, but the original spirit of the band was dead. Bonner's deepest secret from this period was how much he blamed himself for the band's dissolution. He had tried to be everything to everyone: leader, protector, mediator, and creative force, but had failed to address the underlying issues that success had created. The perfectionist who had held the band together through years of struggle couldn't find a way to navigate the challenges of prosperity. In interviews years later, former band members would speak diplomatically about creative differences and pursuing individual opportunities. But Bonner knew the truth was far messier and more painful. The Ohio Players hadn't been destroyed by external forces or changing musical tastes. They had been torn apart by human nature itself. The final secret he carried was how the breakup changed his entire relationship with music. What had once been pure joy became tainted with sadness and regret. Every time he heard one of their old hits on the radio, he was reminded not of their artistic achievements, but of what they had lost along the way. In the months before his death in January 2013, Leroy "Sugarfoot" Bonner began opening up about the Ohio Players in ways he never had during their heyday. Fighting cancer and knowing his time was limited, he finally felt free to tell the complete truth about what had really happened behind the scenes of one of funk's most successful bands. The biggest secret he revealed wasn't about personal feuds or dramatic betrayals. It was about the impossible burden of trying to maintain artistic integrity in an industry designed to exploit creativity for profit. Bonner confessed that every major decision he had made as the Ohio Players' leader was shaped by his fear of losing control over their music and their lives. In interviews with close friends and family members, Bonner admitted that he had never felt worthy of the success the Ohio Players achieved. The scared teenager who had run away from home at 14 was still there inside the confident frontman, constantly worried that everything would be taken away as suddenly as it had arrived. This insecurity had driven him to be overprotective of the band, which ultimately contributed to the very problems he was trying to prevent. He revealed that the controversial album covers that had defined their public image were actually his way of maintaining control over their artistic presentation. By embracing the sexuality and provocation that the music industry wanted to impose on them, he thought he could stay ahead of external manipulation. But he later realized that this strategy had backfired, reducing their musical achievements to mere marketing spectacle. The most painful confession came when Bonner admitted that he had known for years before the 1980 breakup that the band was headed for dissolution. He had seen the warning signs, the growing resentments, the financial disputes, the loss of creative unity, but had been too proud to address them directly. Instead, he had hoped that their shared history and musical chemistry would be enough to overcome the problems. Bonner also revealed the personal cost of his leadership style. His need to be the strong, stable center of the Ohio Players had prevented him from seeking help when he needed it most. During their peak years, he had struggled with anxiety, depression, and alcohol abuse, but had hidden these problems from his bandmates because he felt they depended on his strength. The secret that haunted him most was his relationship with Walter "Junie" Morrison, whose departure in 1974 had marked the beginning of the band's internal troubles. Bonner confessed that he had never forgiven himself for failing to keep Morrison in the group, and that every subsequent conflict felt like another manifestation of his inadequacy as a leader. But perhaps the most revealing confession was about his relationship with success itself. Bonner admitted that he had never learned how to enjoy the Ohio Players' achievements because he was always worried about losing them. The gold records, the sold-out concerts, the recognition from other musicians. None of it had brought him the satisfaction he expected because it all felt temporary and fragile. In his final interviews, Bonner expressed regret not about the band's breakup, but about his inability to appreciate what they had accomplished while they were accomplishing it. He had been so focused on protecting the Ohio players from external threats that he had failed to nurture the joy and creativity that had made them special in the first place. The ultimate secret that Bonner carried to his grave was his belief that the Ohio players could have lasted indefinitely if he had been a better leader. He blamed himself for not finding ways to address the financial inequalities, creative tensions, and personal conflicts that ultimately tore the band apart. The man who had held them together for 15 years never stopped feeling responsible for their dissolution. But in those final conversations, Bonner also revealed something else. Despite all the pain and regret, he was proud of what the Ohio players had achieved. They had created music that transcended racial and cultural boundaries, influenced countless other artists, and brought joy to millions of people around the world. That legacy, he said, was worth all the struggles they had endured. When Leroy Sugarfoot Bonner died on January 26, 2013, he took with him the complete story of the Ohio players' rise and fall. But the secrets he had finally shared painted a picture of a man who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to create something beautiful and lasting, and who had learned too late that the greatest tragedy wasn't the band's breakup, but his inability to forgive himself for being human. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.